Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review, a subsection of the Like Iron podcast where we pick an academic article and discuss it. If you enjoy nerding out about strength, fitness, and performance, this is the podcast for you. Remember, research is ever-changing, and our views and opinions will change as well. None of the information in this show should be seen as medical advice, and you should always talk to your medical provider before starting a fitness regimen. Let's get into the cast, Like Iron.
Come paint my face, come take my
Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review. My name is Shannon. I'm here with my co-host, Wes. Say hi, Wes.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we have yet another paper, as we should, since it's a research review. Today, we're talking about athlete monitoring and kind of the metrics that some people use. Specifically, we're talking about subjective versus objective monitoring tools, which we will get into in a little bit. But the title of the paper is Monitoring the Athlete Training Response, Subjective Self-Reported Measures Trump Commonly Used Objective Measures, a Systematic Review. It is authored by Anna Saw, Luana Main, and Paul Gaston, and it is published in the British Medical Journal, looks like. So we can kind of get into the background of what a subjective and objective measure is. Basically, when you're monitoring an athlete or monitoring training loads, there's multiple ways you can do that. And the kind of two domains are either subjective or objective. Subjective is the athlete reporting on themselves, like their well-being, their perceived stress levels, their perceived recovery. Basically, it's their perception of how they're doing. Objective is more physiological measures, blood measures, things like inflammatory markers that you can measure via the blood or heart rate, things like that. Was that a good synopsis for you, Wes?
Yeah.
Yep. So what this paper is looking at, the purpose of this paper was to compare the two, see if subjective and objective measures correlated. So if your cortisol went up, would your perceived stress go up as well? And then also look at the responsiveness of each to changes in training load. So if we have this acute spike in training load, do we see a corresponding spike in perceived stress or perceived dive of perceived recovery? And do we see a corresponding increase in cortisol and these inflammatory markers, heart rate, stuff like that? We can kind of get into what they found. Basically, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, depending on how versed you are in this literature, the subjective measures were a little bit more reliable, and also they were more responsive to changes in training load. So, Wes, what are the thoughts you had on this paper?
Yeah, I thought this is, super interesting. Again, it's one of, I don't know if we mentioned this already, but it was a systematic review. And so, again, they're just looking at the literature at large and then, making a comparison using, some advanced statistics. And we'll link the paper so you guys can look at the methods so you can see the stats they did. But yeah, I thought it was super interesting. I think it goes to show, it supports our bias a little bit, that the individual is of utmost importance and that their perception does matter, does have merit. And so, we see like in this paper that, when you increase, acute training loads or have chronically high training loads, that totally affects someone's perceived stress, And so in a practical application, I would say that, if we have these massive acute spikes and then that totally affects the individual, maybe we should have more gradual increases to a point, and then potentially taper or something like that. Because it also said that, chronically high training loads can also affect, the individual's perceived stress. And so I think that, over time, like we've preached before, you need to have some sort of progression. So something does have to get hard. It can't always just be, super easy all the time. But I think, in terms of programming, you can have some sort of structured approach where maybe it starts off easy and then progressively gets harder to a point where you're pushing it, and then you taper. And the reason I say that taper is useful is for physiological reasons, but also this paper suggests that a decrease in acute training load had an increase in the individual's perceived stress. And so, like, basically they felt a little bit better once they took a little bit of that load away. And so that could be a useful strategy, is just work up to something challenging, then taper, work up to something challenging and then taper, and then kind of progress like that along the way.
I found it interesting that the subjective and objective measures didn't really correlate too well. There wasn't a very strong association. So, like, you could have a very high perceived stress, and if you were just tracking the objective measures, those markers wouldn't necessarily correlate very well with that perceived stress.
Yeah.
So if your athlete is feeling banged up or they're not motivated, that may not be reflective in these blood measures or these heart rate measurements that you're taking.
Yeah.
I think both have their place and both are useful. So there's no reason that you only have to use subjective or only have to use objective. You want to use the best combination that allows you to track your athlete's response.
Yeah. So I think that this just goes to show that I know this kind of sounds wishy-washy, but like your emotional state and psychological state, do matter. They will affect your perceived well-being, but also your training and your performance. And so I think that as long as you are, truthfully reporting how you feel and not necessarily just sandbagging it to get out of the sake of, harder training, but truthfully reporting how you feel, it's just also a good argument for auto-regulation, like we've preached before, to have some sort of, structure, but also allow variability in that structure to kind of match your perception or your perceived stress on that given day. I think it's still a useful tool to incorporate into programs.
Yeah, because the subjective measures are so responsive to the training loads. We can make more kind of real-time decisions with those. So if somebody comes in and their scores on these subjective measures show that they're just like feeling like crap, then we can pull back on that day because it's so responsive.
Yeah.
One limitation here, I think, is the fact that, like you said, this is done mostly in like very competitive athletes at multiple levels. So they probably have high motivation already. And they're, like you said, unlikely to sandbag. My guess is they're unlikely to sandbag as much as maybe like your average Joe Schmo or your weekend kind of warrior. Another limitation, these subjective measures are pretty extensive, right? So there's these, I think they used 3 or 4 questionnaires. And they measured those, at least all the studies did. They used different ones. But these are questionnaires of like 15 questions sometimes, where in a real life setting, at least in our setting, especially if we're coaching distance or online, it may not be realistic to get those questionnaires filled out. And if obviously there's still merit in taking just like hey, how are you feeling today? Or give me a 1 to 10, like a session RPE, stuff like that. But is it as reliable and responsive if we're only taking one measurement? I don't know. I kind of doubt it, but I think there's still some use there.
Yeah. I think this is one of those things too. And I know they didn't directly look at this particular thing, but pain or like perceived stress, these things are, subjective experiences. And I think one downside to constantly badgering someone about how they feel is, like, let's say they are in a poor mood or experiencing pain, it's just constant reminder of the state that they're in. And so sometimes it can just be a self-fulfilling prophecy, just being like, oh, rate your pain, rate your pain, rate your pain, or rate your stress, rate your stress, rate your stress. Like, sometimes it just reminds them of how much stress or pain they're experiencing. And so I think it's a useful tool, but I think that it can be overdone as well. And so, I think this is where, some subjectivity is incredibly important, but it's also, I think we have to be careful of how we phrase questions or how, we use this thing to our advantage or help, program for the athlete. I think it's, we should be looking to do good and not necessarily harm. And sometimes, in trying to do good, we end up doing harm. And so I think it just comes back to like, all right, let's think about the questions that we're going to pose. Let's think, is this a useful question? Is it going to help with the athlete and their well-being? And then how can we incorporate this into training? Also, like the paper is showing, acute spikes in training load and chronic increases in training load had a correlation between, decrease increased perceived stress. And so maybe saying, okay, if we can just get some sort of like metric, like session RPE or RPE or something like that, where they can, put a number to it, can be useful. And then maybe when we're asking, how they feel, we just need to word it in such a way that it isn't like a constant reminder that they're stressed if they're experiencing that emotion.
Mm. And you're not just looking for one isolated, like, I've got kind of stressed. Like you want, like, you're looking for clusters, like a pattern too.
Yeah.
So let's get into some application here, Wes. Like, what kind of subjective measures do you take with your athletes? What kind of stuff do you do? Objective, subjective.
So, I mean, objectively, the things that we look at, we look for trends across the board, fluctuations in the load on the bar usually, or the volume. Like those are kind of things that we can kind of just objectively analyze and say like, oh, are you tolerating more? And then you can also kind of get that perceived or that perception of, okay, like maybe we see an increase in the number of sets and reps and even load that you're doing, and maybe they feel great too. So it's like, that's sweet. But sometimes maybe you see a huge, increase in volume and load as we're trying to progress an individual, but like you just start seeing, oh, this person's like, shit, I don't feel motivated to train, and I love training. Like some of my athletes, like I freaking love training. And usually when you see that those people start to dislike their training, you might have done too much too soon, or you might want to think about a slightly different strategy, because now you're affecting their adherence and compliance and like an enjoyability to, exercising, which I don't think is useful. So you might want to pull back on the reins a little bit there. So usually I'm looking for, RPEs at a given load. And so if their subjective measure is decreasing with the same load, we have decent, evidence to suggest that, hey, they're probably getting stronger because they're using the same weight, but now it feels much easier to them. And so maybe we can increase, this is how we can increase weight, is like, now that this feels so easy, let's throw a little bit more weight on the bar and see how this feels. And that's, one form of progression over time. I think another thing too that I've been starting to use for myself is, session RPE. It's like, how hard was the session at large? For me, it's new to do that. And so like, I don't necessarily know how accurate it is at first, but I think it's one of those things that you can practice and write down, and it just helps, guide training a little bit. And then some other things, I just tell my athletes to just be open with me and tell me how they're feeling. So like, I don't badger them all the time, like every single day, like, how you feeling, how you feeling, how you feeling. I leave it more of like, hey, like this is, a relationship between me and you. I'm here to help you with your programming, but there are a lot of things that go into your programming, like, your life in general. And so if anything ever comes up, feel free to let me know. That way they feel like they can tell me when something's going on in their lives, and I'm not constantly badgering them. And so I think, at least for me, I think that works fairly well, because they still feel like there's a relationship between me and them. So they do feel open to talking to me. But also, it's not me constantly badgering them to the point where maybe it's just constantly reminding them how much, stress they're in or pain they're in if they're experiencing that. Like a lot of the times we'll have, athletes who, maybe they're just dealing with some sort of nagging thing, and it's just super frustrating to them. Like maybe their knees are feeling kind of weird, or their back's feeling kind of weird, or the shoulders feeling kind of weird. Like those are common things that you may see in powerlifting, especially as you start really increasing the volume or the intensity. And, those could be indicators that maybe you did too much too soon, but also sometimes, these things, shit just happens. And so it's like, okay, how do we get this person to still train and train to tolerance, but not constantly feel like, pain is what defines them. And so if I'm always asking them what's their pain, then that might again be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it might not be useful. But if I leave it open-ended, like, hey, just let me know how you're feeling, then some days they're like, hey, I feel great. This is awesome. I feel good. And so they feel like they can let me know if something's going on, so we can stay on, like, I'd still stay up to date with them on how they feel, but maybe it's just not as a consistent reminder.
Yeah, that's the the nice thing about working one-on-one with somebody. Like you can make these questionnaires or subjective measures more into a conversation than just like, how's your stress? How's your recovery? Are you motivated today?
Yeah.
All right. How much sleep did you get last night? When's the last time you took a shit? Like,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
very like discrete questions. You can just make it more of a natural conversation. That becomes a little more challenging in a group setting or in team sports, which most of this research is on. Like when you're working with large groups of athletes, you gotta like, okay, get their measurements and then kind of look at them briefly. You can't have a hour-long conversation with every single athlete. One thing that I'm finding challenging or interesting to work out is how to do all of this with distance coaching, because right now I'm not coaching anybody in person. It's all online programming and conversations just over text, over email, over video chat. So trying to work out how do I get these subjective measures has been interesting. So one thing I started using, as Wes was talking about, was session RPE and duration. So basically the overall difficulty on a scale of 1 to 10 of that session, and then the time of the session, and then I calculate out a kind of like the session RPE load, so labeled arbitrary units. A lot of this research comes from team sports, so we're not sure yet how valid it is in a barbell sport setting. But I figured it's going to be nice to track and kind of see if we can see trends. Like I'm not looking at one value and saying this is it, but if I see trends where, and basically I know what the days should kind of generally be. Like if I have a high stress day versus a low stress day, that high stress day should be higher than the low. If I see the low creeping up, and there's some interesting papers about this that I was going to link Wes to that I just read, but if we start seeing that low creep up, then okay, we know we need to change something, like something's going on with that athlete.
Yeah.
And all these measures that we've been talking about are kind of measures of training load, like subjective training load. This paper itself was kind of looking at like training response. So it's a little bit different. Obviously we can't take blood measures and stuff like that, so we're a little bit limited there. But luckily it seems like those are not the most useful anyways. I've tried using like questionnaires, like how motivated are you? How's your sleep been? But part of the problem with all this stuff is you have to get the athlete to adhere to filling that stuff out. Like especially in distance coaching, if you have it on a spreadsheet, you have to make sure they're trying to fill that out every day. And like depending on the like generational gap between you and your client, like I have clients that are in their 50s using an Excel sheet and they don't want to fill anything out. So it makes it kind of difficult. So when that happens, I just try to open up, like Wes said, a conversation between my clients and I. Like I'll check in with them weekly, see how everything's feeling. Like, hey, how's the training been going? Like, has been feeling light, heavy, okay? And hopefully they're not lying to me and I can get those questions answered from that.
Yeah, I think it's something that's so interesting to me because we need subjective measures, you know, and it's like a fine line between, and this is what, I think that I've just been messing around with my coaching, just thinking about it is, you don't want to not ask questions because then people don't think you care about them. It's like, oh, this person, isn't in touch with me, like psychologically or like emotionally. And there's a huge level of buy-in when it comes to coaching, but you're also dealing with these people all the time, so they're going to come talk to you about a lot of the stuff that happens in their life. And so I think it's super useful to listen to them and be empathetic towards them. But at the same time, it's also one of those things like, all right, I want to listen, I want to be empathetic, but how can I also not, do harm, in the sake of continuing asking so many questions. And so, yeah, I think, open, like Shannon was saying, open-ended conversations are really useful because maybe it's not specific to, their pain or their stress. Maybe it's just like, hey, how's your life? Maybe it's a little bit more general, and so they can talk to you about other things as well. So, I think that's so far been pretty useful with coaching for me. It's just more of those conversational based things rather than like rating everything.
Yeah. And I think just goes back to what we've talked about before. It's like kind of, again, building that relationship. That's what it comes down to at the end, at least in our sport, and in all athletes circumstances in sports, but especially when we're working one-on-one, it's just easier to do, and you can get a little more in depth with it.
Yep.
All right. So I think, do you have anything else to say on this paper?
I think I'll just kind of restate this. When it comes to practical application, again, this paper saw that with acute increases in training load or chronic, levels of, training load that you saw, it affects subjective measures. And so this could be useful. Sometimes it's really hard when you're programming for someone to have like a hard cutoff of like, okay, this is going to be the length of this training block, and then we're going to cut off. When in reality, it might be useful to monitor that athlete and be like, all right, we're going to slowly increase and titrate the work up each week, see how you feel. And then maybe once you reach a point where, the performance starts to drop a little bit, and maybe they start reporting like, hey, just perceived increases in stress or stuff like that. Like that might be a good time to call it for that block, take a little taper, and then restart. And then you can continue to use that, to kind of guide future decision making. Life happens sometimes, so some blocks might go better than other blocks due to things that happen in people's lives. But I think, having some sort of general framework, which is kind of like the guideline or the template for the program, but also being able to change and have some variability is going to be incredibly useful, because sometimes it's just hard to fit everything into like a super rigid structure. When it's still nice to have structure, I think it just needs to have a little bit of flexibility within, so things can change if they need to.
You're dealing with people, which are inherently probably the most complex thing we know of.
Yeah.
So you have to be willing to adapt to changing circumstances. All right. This has been a Like Iron Research Review. Hit us up with any questions. Leave us a like. You're going to hear this in the outro anyways, but goodbye.
See ya.
Someday you too will go to war. And
Thanks for listening to this Like Iron production. As always, we love to hear from our audience, so if you have a question or want to chat, drop a line in the comments or hit us up on social media. You can find us on Instagram at ShannonDubs, at like.iron.strong_Wes, and at like.iron.strong_Jackson. If you like what you hear, let it be known. Like and review or tell your friends, and as always, stay strong like iron.